There are over $300 billion worth of Russian assets sitting in banks located around the world that were frozen at the beginning of Putin's war with Ukraine. Now the question is being raised, what will happen to those Russian billions? Well, that's the biggest question. It's important to note that the billions haven't actually been seized. Yet they're still sitting frozen in accounts while the world debates what to do with them. More questions have arisen during those debates. Is it even legal to seize those assets, essentially taking them from Russian people and banks to use as the West sees fit? And if those assets are seized, does the West stand to lose out in the long run due to Russia's response? Before we dig into those questions, let's take initial stock of the situation. It's near the end of June 2022, and Russia is about 4 months into its invasion of Ukraine. The war hasn't gone as well as Putin had hoped. He thought he was going to be able to essentially smash and grab, destroying Ukraine's military in a matter of weeks so he could annex the country and make it a part of Russia. That's not what happened. Ukraine's forces dug in and defended themselves well, and with the help of overseas allies, they now have money and weapons that make them capable of fighting Russia over the long term. Putin is livid. What was supposed to be a quick victory is leaving him with egg on his face, as the world suddenly sees the Russian military, as large as it may be, might not be as strong or as tactically astute as once believed. Then came the announcement from the United States and its allies. On June 29, 2022, a task force of Ukraine's allies announced sanctions to be placed against Russia. Dubbed the Russian Elites, Proxies, and Oligarchs Task Force, or REPO, the group released a statement saying that it's blocked or frozen billions in Russian assets. Specifically, it's blocked around $30 billion in assets owned by Russian officials and oligarchs, and a staggering $300 billion owned by the country's central bank, which now sits immobilized. Specifics on the total figure are hard to come by, though it's believed to be in the $350 billion region. REPO had taken several months to come to this decision. Initially formed on March 17, 2022, just 3 weeks after Putin's invasion, the group was tasked with putting economic pressure on Putin by cutting off his access to money and resources. At least back then, the hope was that economic sanctions would force Putin to end his invasion and perhaps enter diplomatic talks with Ukraine and its Western allies. We now know that did not happen. At the point of creating this video, the war has raged for nearly 2 years since those billions in assets were frozen. Russia's certainly feeling economic pressure, but it's not enough to stop Putin. He's found ways to circumvent sanctions using a series of alternative supply routes and a complex web of supply chains that see it using other countries as proxy buyers for what it needs. Still, that doesn't mean that REPO's efforts were in vain. Though the war didn't end as they had anticipated, the assets they froze back in March 2022 are still frozen today, and they're surprisingly far-reaching. Beyond the money owned by Russian central banks, the assets include at least 5 stunning yachts taken from Russia's oligarchs and real estate spread worldwide. Let's dig into some specifics, starting with Russia's central bank. According to Reuters, Russia's central bank's primary assets are gold and foreign exchange reserves, which it has liquidized in the form of major currencies and government bonds. All told, those gold and foreign currency reserves are believed to be worth $612 billion, with about half of those reserves being held in Western countries. That half accounts for the $300 billion of frozen Russian central bank assets. The assets haven't been stolen, in the sense that they've been removed from Russia's central bank and moved elsewhere. Rather, they were always in the West to begin with, only now the banks that hold them are refusing to release them to Russia's central bank until Putin ends his war in Ukraine. It's also worth pointing out that this freezing is truly an allied effort. Though the bank's frozen assets total around $300 billion, that money is spread across several major currencies. Chief among these is the euro, of which Russia holds around $207 billion worth. It also has $67 billion in US banks, as well as $37 billion in British pound assets. There's a similar amount in Japanese yen, $36 billion, along with smaller holdings of Swiss francs, Canadian dollars, Singapore dollars, and Australian dollars. Practically all that money is now frozen. Better news for Russia's central bank, it still has its gold reserves, plus those reserves could be liquidated into Chinese yuan if needed, giving the bank the option to at least get its hands on the $300 billion that the West doesn't control. Nevertheless, $300 billion is a lot of money to suddenly lose access to, with REPO allies holding those assets, along with those of Russian citizens that it has frozen as depositories. But again, it's worth reiterating a key point: these assets are frozen, not seized. Still, there's a growing momentum for simply taking those assets and spending them on what the West might consider worthy causes. That momentum comes primarily from the United States, as members of the Republican Party find themselves increasingly divided over whether the country should send even more money to Ukraine. At the time of recording, the U.S. Senate has approved a $75 billion foreign aid package, around $60 billion of which will go to Ukraine following several months of debate. However, that package isn't ready to go to Ukraine just yet. It still needs to make it through the House of Representatives, where it'll likely face further opposition from a section of the Republican Party that believes the money should stay at home and that Ukraine should defend itself with what it already has received. Those Republicans, as well as several other groups, are instead turning their attention to the frozen Russian assets they hold. In the U.S., President Joe Biden has suggested that he would support any legislative efforts that would clear the path toward the seizure of the assets the U.S. holds, the previously mentioned $67 billion that could then be used to help Ukraine. Several Americans believe this is the right course of action. One of them is Simon Johnson, an economist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Speaking to Voice of America, he said that the seizure would send a signal that egregious aggression of this form will not be tolerated. He also points out that Russia likely built all of its foreign currency reserves to provide itself with a buffer that would make it free to engage in reckless behavior, such as invading Ukraine. By claiming the Russian assets that America holds, Johnson says the U.S. could send a clear message that if Russia wants to engage with the global economy, it needs to learn how to play nice. That would mean no running up account surpluses only to try to use the money to finance invasions. So there's a growing movement in the U.S. to seize the Russian assets. At present, there isn't a plan in place for what to do with them once they're seized, but the argument seems to revolve around the money being sent to Ukraine to help either fund its war effort or rebuild in the wake of the conflict. It's an approach with which the United Kingdom appears to agree. In January 2024, The Guardian, a British newspaper, reported that the UK was putting pressure on all of its Western partners to seize Russia's frozen assets so they could be used not just to rebuild Ukraine physically, but also rebuild its economy. The UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron even claimed that seizing assets was not only legal and politically justified, but would be the moral thing to do as a response to Russia's actions. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Cameron said that the world changed when Putin launched this illegal invasion, and that the countries currently supporting Ukraine should be prepared to do some innovative thinking about how we use these resources to help Ukraine. Cameron went on to point out that the combined economic might of the countries backing Ukraine in its war effort was 25 times the size of Russia's economy, essentially suggesting that the seized assets should be used as firepower, in an economic sense, to really hit Russia where it hurts. But how would seizing Russian assets be the moral thing to do? Cameron had an explanation for that too. He says that Russia is going to have to pay some form of reparations for launching what he calls an illegal invasion. The frozen money would be part of those reparations regardless of the war's outcome. So why wait to see what happens? Spend it now so it can help Ukraine rather than leave it sitting in banks where it's inaccessible to anybody. Interestingly, The Guardian suggests another reason why the US, notably Biden and the Democratic Party, should join the UK in its cause to seize the assets: Donald Trump. It quotes Bill Browder, the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, as saying that the Democrats should look to seize the assets they currently hold now in response to the possibility that Trump could win the upcoming presidential election. He points out that Trump has already claimed that he'll be able to solve the Ukraine crisis in one day if elected. According to Browder, this likely means that he would cut off funding to Ukraine, essentially handing victory to Russia. Whether that's true remains to be seen. However, Browder says, putting aside all niceties, that confiscating of the $350 billion is Donald Trump insurance. By seizing those funds before the next election, Browder says Biden can at least ensure the money makes its way to Ukraine regardless, minimizing the impact of Trump cutting Ukraine off from funding if he does return to office. There's just one problem. The United States and the United Kingdom don't control all of the frozen assets. Combined, they hold $104 billion and around a third of what could be seized. The other major asset freezers are Japan and the European Union. Japan, which holds $36 billion in Russian assets, is already in talks with the United States about what it might do with that money. That's according to the Japan News, which reported on January 23, 2024, that America's Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo said that the two countries would soon meet to discuss the assets. According to Adeyemo, these talks will take place before a G7 summit scheduled for late February, just prior to this video's scripting, so we don't know the outcome yet. However, Adeyemo will likely argue that Japan should seize the assets to support Ukraine, with the Japan News saying that he is looking forward to working with Japan to consider support for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Let's assume that Japan agrees with the US and by extension the UK, and it decides to seize the Russian assets it holds, allowing $140 billion to be funneled into Ukraine. That still leaves the largest asset freezer of all, the European Union, or the EU. As we mentioned earlier, the EU holds a little over $200 billion of Russia's foreign assets, It seems the euro was Putin's currency of choice for building foreign reserves, likely because he didn't want to feel beholden to the United States, though that decision has come back to bite him, given that the money he held in euros is now frozen. But there's at least a little light at the end of the tunnel for Russia when it comes to its euro stockpiles. The EU is taking a far more cautious approach than the US and the UK in handling those assets. At least that's the impression gained from reading a report from Reuters published on the same day as the Japan News report. It points out that the G7 summit scheduled for late February will likely see extensive discussions around the legality of seizing Russia's frozen assets. But despite those talks, the odds of the EU going ahead with doing so are fairly low. Part of the reasoning might come from the fact that the EU is a collective of nations, each with its own opinion on what it should be doing with Russia. Reuters points out that the opposition Biden is facing from some sectors of the Republican Party in the US regarding sending more financial aid to Ukraine is being mirrored in the EU. Right now, the group is trying to agree on sending a $54.36 billion aid package of its own, though it faces a sturdy opposition from Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, who Reuters claims has close ties to Putin. Seizing the Russian assets would at least render those ties debatable. But many in the EU believe it could open up a legal can of worms that puts the organization on the back foot. One senior official quoted by Reuters claims, confiscation of the capital of Russian assets is not going to happen. He says there's no agreement between the EU member states, meaning that seizing the $200 billion in euros that Russia's central bank holds in Europe is simply impossible. Luxembourg's foreign minister Xavier Bettel is also quoted as being extremely wary over what seizing Russia's assets might mean in the longer term. Speaking to Reuters, he discusses a hypothetical scenario in which the EU agrees to deliver billions of dollars to Ukraine, likely intending to use the seized assets to fund that donation. And in 6 months, he says, we have a judicial decision saying we're not allowed to give it to them. Who will pay then? It's a fair question and one the US and UK don't have to consider when it comes to the assets they might seize. Both countries will have total control over where their share of the assets would go, with little prospect of opposition forming or internal judicial reviews preventing them from sending the money to Ukraine. The EU isn't in that position. Each member state, particularly those holding Russian assets, would have to agree to seize the assets and agree on what to do with them. As we can see with the Hungary issue, that might not happen. But an even more pressing concern for the EU is that seizing Russia's foreign assets could have major implications for the euro. What if investors in the currency start pulling out? It's a possibility. After all, a not insignificant portion of Russia's frozen assets belongs to officials and oligarchs. These are individuals who've invested in the euro and who may soon see their money taken away from them as punishment for Russia's actions in Ukraine. That seizing would set a precedent that other individual investors and perhaps entire countries would take note of and recognize as a possible action that could be levied against them in the future. The euro's value could decline as a result, meaning the EU would have shot itself in the foot as it attempts to punish Russia. Of course, we can't know for certain that this loss of investment would happen. However, we do know that Moscow has threatened its own action if the frozen money doesn't eventually return to Russian hands. In December 2023, when discussing the seizure of Russian assets started to heat up, the Kremlin issued a stark warning. It said that Ukraine's allies could go ahead with the seizure of over $300 billion in Russia's assets if they wanted, but Russia's response would not be kind. After all, it supposedly has a list of American and European assets that it could seize as well, assuming G7 leaders decide to confiscate what Russia believes it owns. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesperson for the Kremlin, claimed that any seizure levied by Ukraine's allies would simply be a theft that violates international law and undermines both the reserve currencies in which Russia holds these assets and the global economy. He went on to say that other nations would see what the US and the EU have done, undermining their confidence, precisely what worries the EU. Then, when asked if there could be a specific list of Western assets the Kremlin could focus on should a seizure occur, he had 3 simple words: yes, there is. Peskov refused to answer any questions related to what those assets might be. However, a later Reuters report published on January 21, 2024, offers some insight. It quoted Russia's RIA state news agency as claiming that the West would stand to lose around $288 billion of investment into Russia if Ukraine's allies decide to seize the frozen Russian assets. To support this claim, it cited data showing direct investment into Russia by a combination of G7 nations, the EU, Switzerland, and Australia, all of which have currencies Russia has used as reserves, totaling $288 billion by the end of 2022. Of that $288 billion, the EU holds $223.3 billion, around $20 billion more than the value of the euro currency Russia holds in reserve, meaning that Russia's choice to seize that money would lead to the EU being worse off. Britain and the US wouldn't fare quite so poorly. RIA's report claims the UK holds $18.9 billion of assets in Russia, which is around half of the British assets that Russia holds. As for the US, it apparently holds $9.6 billion of Russian assets, which is less than a sixth of what Russia holds in the United States. Still, both would stand to lose out overall if they seized Russia's frozen assets and pledged them to Ukraine. Russia could just respond by seizing their assets as well, and the combined $288 billion hole this seizure would leave in Western countries' bank accounts would have a severe impact if the $300+ billion that they seize all goes to Ukraine. It's worth noting that Reuters couldn't confirm the data that RIA used in its report. These claims of $288 billion in assets that Russia could seize might be a fabrication, or at least an embellishment, to make Ukraine's allies less likely to seize Russia's frozen assets. But it could be true, and if it is, we come back to the question that opened the video. What will happen to the Russian billions? The European Commission, or EC, has a potential solution that it claims could serve as a middle ground between keeping Russia's assets frozen and seizing them entirely. That proposal centers around a Belgian company, Euroclear. Euroclear is one of the two clearinghouses used for securities trading in the euro market, with its specialization being the verification of the information that brokers provide related to securities transactions involving European exchanges. The company is huge, with Reuters quoting a senior EU official claiming that Euroclear manages trillions and its bankruptcy would be far greater than the budget of the EU. In other words, he's saying that Russia's response to the West seizing frozen assets would spell serious trouble for Euroclear and the EU as a whole. Enter the EC's proposal. The EC says that it aims to introduce a set of standard rules that would govern how the EU states currently holding frozen Russian assets can use those assets. It will ultimately tell these states that they need to put those assets aside, keeping them frozen while clarifying each state's legal obligations relating to the money. On the surface, it sounds like the EC's proposal means those assets couldn't be used at all, but that's not the case. The proposal includes no direct rules on transferring any new money that the frozen assets generate into the EU coffers. In short, EU states won't be able to seize the billions in Russian assets they hold, but the proceeds from those investments, the taxes related to them, any interest earned by those billions upon billions of dollars, that would all be fair game. This approach could generate a fairly large sum of money to feed to Ukraine's war chest. Reuters says that Euroclear holds around $125 billion of the $207 billion of Russian assets that are tied up in the euro. Belgium estimates it'll collect 2.3 billion euros, around $2.48 billion, on the sum of the 2023-2024 tax year alone. Along with additional profits generated from Russia's frozen assets, it's estimated that the EU could provide Ukraine with between $15 billion and $17 billion over the next 4 years, all without seizing the assets it has frozen. Perhaps this is the path that Ukraine's other allies could follow. If $207 billion worth of assets could generate up to $17 billion in 4 years, the full $350 billion or so could perhaps bring that number reasonably close to $30 billion. It would be a far cry from the hundreds of billions Ukraine would receive if the assets were seized fully, but if the purpose of this money is to help rebuild Ukraine and its economy, the idea could at least provide a constant stream of revenue into the country. This way, the holders of Russia's foreign assets wouldn't have to worry so much about Moscow seizing their assets. However, it's important to highlight that the EC's plan is just a proposal, at least at the time of creating this video. All 27 EU nations would have to vote for the concept to become a reality. That could be a problem, as those within the EU with Russian sympathies, such as the previously mentioned Hungary, could just as easily veto this idea as they could any ideas about seizing the full $207 billion Russia invested in the euro. Of course, there's one more man who's lent his voice to the discussions in the recent months: Volodymyr Zelensky. Speaking to the BBC, he said, "If the world has $300 billion, why not use it?" Building on this simple argument, Zelensky points out that Russia's effectively destroyed billions of dollars of Ukrainian infrastructure and continues to do so as part of its war. So if the West holds more than $300 billion in Russian assets, that money has to be used to rebuild what Russian missiles destroyed. Why does your society have to think about how to help? Zelensky asked the BBC, expressing frustration about how the frozen money hasn't yet been sent to help his country. Sadly, as you've learned in this video, it's not just as simple as seizing and sending. But that doesn't mean that what Zelensky wants has no chance of happening at all. Though the EU expresses clear concerns about the legality of such an action, some in the United States point out that they've seized assets before, twice in fact. The Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR, says that the precedent has already been set for the US, at the very least, to transfer the Russian assets it holds into an escrow account that could be used to fund Ukraine's recovery. After all, Ronald Reagan did exactly that when dealing with Iran in 1981, when he sent $8 billion of Iranian assets into a special escrow account, overseen by the Bank of England but controlled by the Algerian Central Bank. $5.9 billion of those funds were used to pay Iranian debts to various European and American banks. Just $2.9 billion made its way back to Iran, and that was only as a reward of sorts for the freeing of hostages. President George H.W. Bush did the same thing to Iraq in 1992 during the Gulf War. For instance, the Bush senior administration seized $50 million of Iraqi oil. It used those proceeds from its sale to help fund a United Nations relief effort to bring shelter, food, and medicine to minorities in Iraq who were under threat from Saddam Hussein's regime. The point is simple. Seizure of foreign assets has happened before. That means it could happen again, at least in the US. Of course, the caveat to all this is that neither Iran nor Iraq had the sort of financial muscle to respond to those seizures. Russia, at least if the RAA is to be believed, does. So again, it's not quite as simple as taking the frozen money and handing it over to Ukraine. The consequences to Russia and the West could be extreme if the holders of Russia's frozen assets followed that path. In fact, doing so could spark an economic war of sorts, a tit-for-tat involving Russia seizing Western assets held in its banks while the West does the same. Ukraine might benefit, at least in the short term, from a $350 billion injection into its war-torn economy. But are the risks really worth it when Russia supposedly holds enough cards to allow it to inflict severe financial pain on the EU, as well as cause significant issues for the UK and the US in response? That's a question we'll hand over to you. Do you think the countries currently holding frozen assets should seize them to send Russia's money to Ukraine? Do you think it's even legal for them to do so? Tell us what you think in the comments. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.